Yo, what is going on? Mike from Mike Talk Sports. Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul just got made for a boxing bout. Let me break down this fight and let me tell you guys who I think is going to win this fight. So first off, let's address the elephant in the room, the size disadvantage for Nate Diaz. And let me tell you guys why I'm significantly more nervous for Nate Diaz's size compared to Tyron Woodley's size. The thing is about Tyron Woodley, he's a natural 170er. And when I say he's a natural 170er, he's a bigger guy who has to cut to 170 pounds. So realistically, he's walking around at a pretty high weight, much higher than a Nate Diaz. When a guy like Tyron Woodley goes from 170 pounds to 185 pounds, 195 pounds, he has a very solid frame. He still looks extremely in shape. He looks extremely cut. That extra weight and that extra muscle really goes to his legs, his thighs, his upper body, his shoulder, his pecs. So Tyron Woodley can really fill out a bigger frame. This is sadly not the case with Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz is a really lean, cut-looking 155er. Once he went up to 170 in the welterweight division in the UFC, not to say his physique looked horrible, but his physique didn't look that good, and it did not look like he was cutting all that much weight. So a Nate Diaz fighting at 185 pounds, 195 pounds, man, I think he's going to look a little bit slower in there, especially considering his age, and he's just not going to look as agile, and his conditioning is not going to be as good as it normally would at 170 pounds or 155 pounds. And that's really the inherent issue for Nate Diaz in this fight, because cardio and being extremely relentless with the forward pressure really is the name to the game for Nate Diaz and his boxing style. Nate Diaz really breaking down his boxing. He's a very good boxer and one of the better boxers the UFC has ever saw. He's one of those traditional boxers that does end up fighting MMA. Obviously, he does have that incredible jiu-jitsu game, but again, he's more of that traditional boxer. He's going to have that more Philly shell, that more traditional boxing stance, and that more traditional boxing guard. When I allude to that Philly shell, he loves that southpaw. He can go orthodox, but he's definitely more southpaw. He has that really, really strong left hand straight. And again, Nate Diaz, the name of his game, relentless pressure with that jab and that straight. That's somewhat of an issue, though, in this fight for Nate Diaz, is that predictability. He's so unpredictable in the 1-2 and how he throws it and how he sets it up. But realistically, with Nate Diaz, for Jake Paul in this camp, he really just has to look out for the jab straight, because that's really what Nate Diaz loves throwing. The hooks are somewhat there, but he has more of that Stockton slap, that swinging, hooking hook. And for me, that doesn't work as well in boxing than it does in MMA. So Nate Diaz is really going to stick behind that jab. And to me, he's going to throw 60%, 60%, 60%, 80% to the body. He does have an underrated straight to the body as well. I'm seeing, Nate Diaz is only a jab straight to the head. He does have good body shots, but the thing is, he just doesn't mix it up well. You look at a guy like Anderson Silva that Jake Paul just fought pretty recently. Anderson Silva really mixes it in well, and Jake Paul probably had a difficult time trying to emulate Anderson Silva's boxing style in the gym with some sparring partners. But with Nate Diaz, it'll be pretty easy to replicate his style for Jake Paul leading into this fight. Again, just have a more slippery guy who's very unorthodox, obviously has a southpaw stance as well, and is really going to mix in a couple different looks with the feints. And then, of course, Nate is going to fire off that 1-2 jab. Looking at Jake Paul here, I really like this stylistic matchup for Nate Diaz on paper in the technical aspect, because Nate Diaz does so well against guys who are power punchers, guys who don't throw with a lot of volume, but guys who are going to look to knock you out in one punch. And that really is Jake Paul. Jake Paul has a very orthodox stance, has a very traditional boxing style. But the thing is about Jake Paul, doesn't have a great jab. His straight is pretty solid, but he's very reliant on that overhand right. He's very reliant on that huge left hook. He does have really good body shots, and really his game is somewhat centered around those big body shots, and then he'll feint the body shot into a big overhand right. That's really what won him both Tyron Woodley fights. People were saying in the first Tyron Woodley fight, why isn't Tyron Woodley opening up? Why isn't he throwing all that punches? It's because Jake Paul was consistently hitting him with bombs to the body. And Tyron Woodley really knew that he was trying to set up that overhand right, something that really came to fruition in their second fight, as Jake Paul had a very impressive knockout with that overhand right. But again, I do think Nate Diaz is going to pick up some early rounds here. I just think Nate Diaz is a good stylistic matchup for Jake Paul. But the issue is the frame, the size. To me, if Nate Diaz consistently got overwhelmed in the UFC, in the MMA by bigger guys, you look at the Leon Edwards fight. Leon Edwards is a very big 170er and just overwhelmed Nate Diaz on the ground, but on the feet as well. Same with that Rory McDonald fight. Rory McDonald just absolutely ragdolled Nate Diaz in there. Again, granted, it was in the wrestling department, but then I look at a fight like Jorge Masvidal. Jorge Masvidal is a former 155er as well. He is a strong welterweight. He has a solid frame, but again, he's a pretty flabby welterweight, just like Nate Diaz. And Jorge Masvidal was legitimately tossing Nate Diaz around in the clinch and just completely overwhelming him with his power. To me, if I'm Jake Paul, my game plan in this fight is to come out super aggressive and not let Nate Diaz lead the dance. To me, that was kind of the problem in the McGregor fight, where McGregor was leading the dance, he gassed out, and then Nate Diaz led the dance for the rest of the fight. I could see that happening from Nate Diaz, where Nate Diaz kind of does nothing in the first couple of rounds and then really picks it up, tries to have Jake Paul punch himself out, and then Nate Diaz gets it done in the later rounds. My official prediction for this fight, I think it will be a stoppage. I think Jake Paul stops him with a big overhand right, and Nate Diaz just kind of doesn't want to get up from the canvas, even though he's not actually knocked out and knocked out unconscious. To me, if it's an 8-rounder, I think Jake Paul gets it done in the 7th round. But to me, I really would not be surprised if Nate Diaz gets this done via decision, because again, he does have an advantage on the paper in terms of a technical ability. But again, Jake Paul, that size is overwhelming. And Jake Paul realistically has been training with much higher level boxers in the past 3-4 years than Nate Diaz. So it's not like Jake Paul's technical boxing ability is that significantly far behind Nate Diaz at this point. I know I'm going to get a lot of slack for that comment right there, considering Nate Diaz has been boxing for a significantly longer time than Jake Paul has. But again, Jake Paul just has world-class boxers in his corner. He's coming off a loss and he's going to be extremely hungry for a victory, whereas the motivation with Nate Diaz is kind of in the money and kind of in the paycheck. I would love to see Nate Diaz get this done. I'm going to be rooting for him, but I do think Jake Paul is going to slightly and narrowly get the victory in this one. Let me know what your thoughts on this fight is in the comment section below. Thanks for listening.